A single message left Japan's naval command on a humid night in early May 1942. It was encrypted in a code no American was supposed to understand, but it carried within it the coordinates of Japan's greatest defeat. This wasn't a battle fought with guns, it was one with pencils, paper, and silence. While ships clashed across the Pacific, a handful of men in a windowless basement were already winning the war. They listened to what couldn't be heard. They read what couldn't be seen. And in doing so, they broke the spine of an empire. This is the story of how one American codebreak turned the tide of the Pacific and shattered the backbone of Japan's navy. You'll see how one decrypted word, just 2 letters AF, changed everything. In the closing months of 1941, the world watched Japan move like a tidal wave across the Pacific. Pearl Harbor had burned. The Philippines had fallen. Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, each one swallowed in weeks. The Imperial Japanese Navy seemed unstoppable, a machine of precision and overwhelming force. Carriers cut through the ocean like shadows, appearing where they shouldn't, striking before anyone could respond. America was reeling, its fleet crippled, its confidence shattered. Admirals pored over maps in dimly lit rooms, trying to predict where the next blow would land. But prediction wasn't enough. The Pacific was vast, endless. You could hide an entire fleet in its blue expanse and never be found. Communication became the hidden weapon. Every ship, every plane, every command post sent messages crackling through the ether, encoded, scrambled, transformed into strings of numbers that meant nothing to anyone listening. Japan's main naval code was called JN-25. To American intelligence, it was a fortress. 30,000 5-digit code groups, each one substituted, transposed, layered in mathematical complexity. The Japanese believed it was unbreakable, and for a long time they were right. But wars aren't won by belief, they're won by persistence, by obsession, by men and women willing to sit in cramped rooms for 16-hour shifts, staring at patterns no one else could see, searching for meaning in chaos. Could an unseen team in Hawaii change the course of the Pacific War without ever firing a shot? Could numbers on a page sink battleships? Could silence defeat steel? The answer was coming. It was already being written in intercepted transmissions, in fragments of broken code scattered across desks in Pearl Harbor. The Japanese didn't know it yet, but their greatest strength, their confidence in their own secrecy, was becoming their fatal weakness. Every message they sent added another piece to a puzzle someone else was solving. Every encrypted order brought them one step closer to disaster. The war in the Pacific would be decided not just by courage or firepower, but by knowledge. And in the spring of 1942, knowledge was about to become the most powerful weapon of all. Tokyo, Naval General Staff Headquarters, early 1942. In rooms lined with maps of the Pacific, Japan's strategists planned their next move. Pearl Harbor had been the opening blow. Now they needed the killing stroke. The American fleet was wounded but not destroyed. Carriers still prowled somewhere in the vast ocean, waiting, recovering. Admiral Yamamoto knew that time favored the enemy. America's industrial power was waking up. Factories were churning out ships, planes, weapons. If Japan didn't finish this quickly, the war would turn into a marathon they couldn't win. The operation was codenamed MI. The target, Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,400 miles northwest of Hawaii. Strategically, it was America's furthest outpost, the last stepping stone before the Hawaiian Islands themselves. Symbolically, it was everything. Take Midway, and you force the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle. Sink them, and the Pacific becomes a Japanese lake. The orders went out through JN-25B, the latest iteration of Japan's naval code. Thousands of messages flowing from Tokyo to scattered fleet commanders across the Pacific. Each one encrypted with meticulous care. Each one wrapped in layers of mathematical transformation. The Japanese had faith in their system. It had served them flawlessly through Pearl Harbor, through the rampage across the Pacific. 30,000 code groups, key tables changed regularly, additive books layered on top. It was, they believed, impossible to decipher without the tables. And the tables were locked in safes, distributed only to the most trusted officers. But arrogance breeds carelessness. The code was used constantly for everything. Fleet movements, supply requests, weather reports, administrative trivia. Thousands upon thousands of messages, creating an ocean of data, and in that ocean, patterns emerged, repeated phrases, common beginnings and endings, statistical fingerprints that mathematicians could trace. 5,000 miles away, in the basement of Station HYPO, at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort hunched over a desk buried in paper. Intercepts covered every surface, fragments of transmissions captured by listening posts scattered across the Pacific. Radio operators in Hawaii, Australia, Dutch Harbor, straining to catch every whisper of Japanese Morse code, bleeding through the static. Rochefort looked like he'd forgotten what daylight was. He wore a smoking jacket and slippers, sometimes a kimono. His team worked in shifts, but he barely slept. Coffee and cigarettes kept him upright. Around him, 40 men and women, linguists who'd studied Japanese mathematicians who saw poetry in numbers, typists who transcribed endless columns of 5-digit groups. The room hummed with exhaustion and quiet determination. They'd been chipping away at JN-25 for months, not breaking it, not fully, but recovering fragments. A word here, a phrase there. Enough to glimpse outlines through fog. They knew something was coming. The volume of traffic had spiked. References to an operation, a target, coordinates that didn't quite make sense yet. Then, in late April, a pattern emerged. Multiple messages mentioning the same 2 letters, AF. Rochefort circled it in red pencil. The designator appeared again and again, AF, AF, AF. It was a location, clearly. But which one? Midway, the Aleutians, somewhere else entirely. He didn't know it yet, but that symbol, those 2 simple letters floating through encrypted Japanese transmissions, was about to rewrite history. Everything hinged on what AF meant. Get it wrong, and the American fleet would be looking in the wrong direction when Japan struck. Get it right, and for the first time since Pearl Harbor, America might have a chance. The irony was almost poetic. Japan's faith in their unbreakable code ensured they used it freely, constantly, without restraint. And that freedom created the very patterns that would destroy them. Every message added another clue. Every transmission gave Rochefort's team one more piece of the puzzle. In a war of steel and fire, the real battle was being fought with pencils and paper in a windowless basement by people whose names would never appear in headlines. Deep beneath the 12th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor, the war sounded different. No explosions, no gunfire. Just the rhythmic clatter of typewriters, the whir of electric fans fighting against Hawaiian humidity, and the steady tap-tap-tap of Morse code, receivers translating invisible signals into audible pulses. Station HYPO occupied a basement that felt like a tomb. No windows, no natural light. Time became meaningless down there. Morning and night blurred into one continuous shift, punctuated only by coffee breaks and the changing of watch schedules. 40 souls working in cramped quarters surrounded by filing cabinets stuffed with intercepts, walls covered in charts, tracking Japanese fleet movements, desks buried under worksheets, filled with 5-digit number groups that meant nothing to anyone outside this room. The air tasted stale. Cigarette smoke hung in layers. The fans redistributed heat without cooling anything. Men worked in undershirts, sleeves rolled up sweat-staining paper. Women, the unsung cryptanalysts and linguists, maintained professional composure even as exhaustion darkened the circles under their eyes. Everyone spoke in hushed tones, as if the enemy might somehow hear them through the layers of concrete and ocean separating Hawaii from Tokyo. Commander Joseph Rochefort presided over this subterranean kingdom like a disheveled prophet. He'd been a cryptanalyst since the 1922nd had lived in Japan, studied the language until he could think in it. His mind worked in patterns and probabilities. While other officers wore pressed uniforms, Rochefort shuffled around in a burgundy smoking jacket and carpet slippers, chain-smoking, occasionally sleeping on a cot in the corner when exhaustion finally dragged him down. His analytical partner was Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Admiral Nimitz's intelligence officer. Layton served as the bridge between this basement world and the flag officers who made life-and-death decisions. He understood that Rochefort's eccentricities masked genius. The smoking jacket wasn't affectation. It was comfort for a man who spent 18 hours a day translating enemy secrets. Their method defied simple explanation. They weren't breaking the code in any clean mathematical sense. They were listening to its rhythm. Japanese naval messages followed predictable structures. Certain phrases appeared in predictable places, routing indicators, time groups, standard military formalities. By comparing thousands of messages, tracking which code groups appeared where, noting context and repetition, the team could make educated guesses. Statistical deduction married to linguistic intuition. One of the linguists later described it: "We weren't cracking a safe. We were learning to hear a language spoken underwater, distorted but not destroyed. You listened long enough, patterns emerged. A word here, a phrase there, enough to understand the shape of what was being said, even if you couldn't hear every syllable. The work demanded absolute focus. A single transposition error, one misread digit, and the entire message became garbage. They worked with worksheets, handwritten grids where code groups were matched against possible meanings, checked against previous messages, tested for mathematical consistency. Hours of labor might yield a single recovered word. Days of effort might reveal a sentence fragment. But those fragments mattered. A recovered date told you when something would happen. A location designator told you where. A reference to carriers versus battleships told you what kind of force was being assembled. Piece by piece, the puzzle took shape. The psychological weight was crushing. These people knew their work directly impacted whether sailors lived or died. Every message they failed to decrypt might contain information that could save lives. Every hour wasted meant another hour for Japan to prepare to move to strike. The pressure never lifted. Success meant only that more work waited. Failure meant people died in flames on ships thousands of miles away. Admiral Nimitz understood what was happening in that basement. He trusted Rochefort, completely visited occasionally, asked questions, listened carefully to answers, hedged with probabilities and uncertainties. Unlike some in Washington, Nimitz grasped that intelligence was never perfect. You made decisions with incomplete information, betting your fleet on educated guesses from exhausted people working in a room that smelled like stale coffee and desperation. In late May 1942, those educated guesses were converging on a single conclusion. Something massive was coming, and it was aimed at AF. There's a particular kind of fatigue that comes from fighting an invisible war. Your enemy is numbers, your weapon is patience, your battlefield is paper, and nobody outside your windowless basement believes you can see what you claim to see. The codebreakers at Station HYPO lived in that strange space between certainty and doubt. They could feel the shape of Japanese intentions forming in the intercepts, could sense the gathering storm in the volume and urgency of encrypted traffic. But feeling wasn't proof. Pattern recognition wasn't hard intelligence. And Washington, 3,000 miles away, insulated from the desperate reality of the Pacific, remained skeptical. Rochefort insisted AF was Midway. The traffic patterns, the context clues, the operational logic all pointed there. Japan needed to draw out the American carriers for a decisive engagement. Midway was the perfect bait, close enough to Hawaii to force a response, isolated enough to control the battlefield. It made strategic sense. It fit the intelligence picture. But others disagreed. Analysts in Washington thought AF might refer to the Aleutian Islands, Alaska's remote western chain. Some believed it could be Oahu itself or even the Panama Canal. Without definitive proof, the Navy faced an impossible choice. Scatter forces to cover multiple threats or concentrate based on one basement team's conviction that they'd correctly interpreted fragments of enemy code. The tension ate at Rochefort. He wasn't guessing. He'd spent months immersed in Japanese naval communications, understood their operational patterns, their strategic doctrine, the rhythm of their planning cycles. But how do you explain intuition born from 10,000 hours of pattern analysis? How do you convince an admiral to bet his entire fleet on worksheets covered in half-decrypted 5-digit groups? Lieutenant Commander Layton became Rochefort's voice upstairs. He carried the intelligence estimates to Admiral Nimitz, defended the methodology, vouched for the team working around the clock below deck. In one crucial meeting, facing skepticism about HYPO's conclusions, Layton said simply, "Sir, I know Joe Rochefort. He's not guessing." Nimitz trusted his people. He'd seen Rochefort's work before, watched intelligence predictions prove accurate. But trust wasn't enough. The stakes were too high. Commit the fleet based on wrong intelligence and you hand Japan another devastating victory. Fail to commit and you let the enemy execute their plan unopposed. Down in the basement, the codebreakers felt the weight of disbelief pressing down like physical force. They worked in secrecy, their contributions unacknowledged, their warnings questioned. Some wondered if their labor mattered at all. They decoded messages about operations they'd never see, affecting ships they'd never board, saving lives that would never know their names. One cryptanalyst later recalled the sound of rain on the roof above their basement workspace, how Morse code receivers tapped out enemy transmissions while water drummed overhead. "We didn't see the ships we sank," he said. "Only the messages that made them possible. You'd decrypt an order, pass it up the chain, and weeks later hear that a convoy was intercepted. Maybe your work contributed, maybe it didn't. You'd never know for certain. You just kept listening. The isolation was profound. They couldn't discuss their work outside the basement, couldn't tell families what they did all day, couldn't explain why they looked so exhausted, why they flinched at loud noises, why they sometimes stared into space as if listening to conversations no one else could hear. Some carried the work home in their sleep, dreamed in 5-digit code groups, woke up mentally testing transposition patterns. The line between the encrypted and the real became uncomfortably thin. But through the exhaustion and doubt, they kept working. Because what else could they do? Somewhere out there, Japanese carriers were loading bombs and fueling planes. Sailors were writing final letters home. Commanders were studying maps and calculating odds. The machinery of war was grinding forward, indifferent to uncertainty. And in the basement at Pearl Harbor, 40 people listened to Japan's heartbeat through walls of static and mathematical transformation, trying to hear the future before it arrived in fire and steel. The question wasn't whether they were right about AF. The question was whether anyone would believe them in time. Proof. That's what Washington demanded. Not intuition, not statistical probability. Not Rochefort's unshakable conviction born from months immersed in Japanese communications. They needed something concrete, irrefutable, something that would silence the doubters and justify betting America's remaining carriers on a single location. Rochefort had an idea. It was audacious, almost theatrical. If AF really was Midway, then Japan was listening to American communications just as America listened to theirs. Both sides monitored each other's radio traffic, searching for intelligence. What if you could make the enemy reveal the answer themselves? The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Have Midway send an uncoded message, something mundane, administrative, the kind of communication that wouldn't seem suspicious. Something Japan would intercept and possibly report back to their own headquarters in encrypted form. On May 22nd, Midway's commander received unusual instructions. Send a plain language message stating that the island's freshwater distillation plant had broken down. Report a critical shortage of drinking water. Make it sound urgent but not catastrophic. Just routine problem-solving that required outside assistance. The message went out. Radio operators on Midway transmitted in the clear, unencrypted, easily readable to anyone listening. Midway is short of fresh water. Then Rochefort's team waited. Ears tuned to Japanese frequencies. Fingers ready to transcribe. The trap was set. Now they'd see if Japan took the bait. Days passed. Intercepted Japanese messages poured in, as always encrypted blocks of 5-digit groups, most still opaque, some partially readable. The cryptanalysts scanned each one, searching for any reference to water, to shortages, to Midway's reported problem. On May 25th, they found it. A Japanese message encrypted in JN25B mentioned that AF was experiencing a water shortage. The enemy had intercepted Midway's plain language transmission and reported it up their chain of command using their supposedly unbreakable code. They'd confirmed what Rochefort already knew but couldn't prove. AF was Midway. Definitively, undeniably. The revelation hit the basement like electricity. Months of painstaking analysis, of arguing against skeptics, of defending probabilities and patterns, all validated in one intercepted sentence. The Japanese had told them exactly where they were going, wrapped in the very code meant to hide it. Leighton carried the news to Admiral Nimitz. The proof was undeniable now. No more hedging, no more probabilities stated as percentages. Japan was coming to Midway. The intelligence estimate included timing, early June. It included force composition, multiple carriers, battleships, invasion transports. It included operational intent, draw out and destroy the American carriers, then occupy the atoll. Nimitz studied the intelligence with the calm deliberation that defined his command style. He asked questions, tested assumptions, confirmed details. Then he made his decision. The Pacific Fleet would concentrate at Midway, carriers Enterprise and Hornet already at sea. Carrier Yorktown damaged at Coral Sea, but rushed back into service with round-the-clock repairs that should have taken months. Every available submarine. Land-based aircraft crammed onto Midway's tiny airstrips. The trap within the trap was taking shape. Japan thought they were setting an ambush. Admiral Yamamoto's plan depended on surprise hit. Midway forced the Americans to respond, then crush them with overwhelming force when they arrived too late. But there would be no surprise. The American carriers would already be waiting, positioned northeast of Midway beyond where Japanese scouts expected them, hidden in the vast Pacific, ready to strike when Japan's attention was focused elsewhere. In a war of steel and fire, victory came first to those who listened, and Station HYPO had listened better than anyone thought possible. Rochefort's team didn't celebrate. There was no time. The battle was coming, and there was still work to do. More intercepts to process, more fragments to decrypt, more intelligence to extract from the endless stream of Japanese communications flowing through the ether. They'd proven AF was Midway. Now they had to track the enemy fleet's approach, monitor for changes in Japanese plans, provide updates as the massive operation unfolded across thousands of miles of ocean. The quiet war continued, but now, for the first time since Pearl Harbor, America knew what was coming and where. Knowledge was about to become the most devastating weapon in the Pacific. Dawn, June 4th, 1942. The Pacific Ocean stretched empty and blue in every direction, its surface calm, concealing everything beneath its indifferent vastness. 200 miles northwest of Midway, the Japanese carrier strike force steamed eastward in precise formation. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the same ships that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Their decks crowded with aircraft, their hangars packed with bombs and torpedoes, their crews confident in their invincibility. Admiral Nagumo commanded the strike force with the assurance of a man who'd never tasted defeat. His pilots were the best in the world, his ships were the most modern. His mission was simple: crush Midway's defenses, draw out the American carriers, destroy them. The Japanese believed they held every advantage: surprise, superior numbers, combat experience. Intelligence suggested the American carriers were still near the Solomon Islands, too far away to interfere. By the time they received word of the attack and raced north, Midway would already be burning, and the trap would be set. But surprise belonged to someone else. 200 miles northeast of Midway, 3 American carriers waited in ambush. Enterprise Hornet Yorktown rushed into position based on Rochefort's intelligence, positioned exactly where the Japanese didn't expect them. Admiral Spruance commanded with cold calculation. Admiral Fletcher coordinated with steady nerve. Both knew they were outnumbered. Both knew their crews were less experienced than Japan's veterans. But both knew something the Japanese didn't. They knew when the enemy would arrive. They knew the enemy's plan. They knew where to wait and when to strike. Every Japanese movement had been anticipated, predicted, war-gamed in conference rooms, where intelligence officers briefed from worksheets covered in decrypted fragments. At 0430 hours, Japanese planes launched from their carriers, roaring into the pre-dawn darkness toward Midway. The atoll's radar picked them up 100 miles out. Fighters scrambled. Anti-aircraft crews manned their guns. The base prepared for the onslaught everyone knew was coming. The Japanese bombers hit hard, cratering runways, destroying buildings, killing Marines who fought back with desperate courage. But Midway's defenses held. The airfield remained operational. And while Japanese planes hammered the atoll, American scout planes found the enemy carriers. The reports crackled back to Enterprise and Hornet. Contact, 4 carriers, bearing range speed. Everything Rochefort had predicted, everything the codebreakers had pulled from encrypted intercepts was proving true in fire and steel. The American carriers launched everything they had. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, fighters, every plane that could fly, hurled itself toward the Japanese fleet. The attack was uncoordinated, desperate waves of aircraft arriving piecemeal instead of in the massed formations doctrine demanded. The torpedo bombers came in first low and slow, and Japanese Zeros slaughtered them. Of 41 torpedo planes launched, only 6 returned. Entire squadrons were annihilated, but the sacrifice bought time. While Zeros were down low, chasing torpedo bombers, American dive bombers arrived high above, unnoticed, unopposed. They rolled into their attacks from 14,000 feet, screaming down through empty sky toward carriers whose decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers died. Akagi Kagasoryu hit by bombs that detonated fuel lines and armed torpedoes, triggering explosions that ripped through hangars packed with planes. The ships became floating infernos. Crew abandoned ship. Admirals transferred flags to destroyers and watched their carriers burn. 5,000 miles away in the basement at Pearl Harbor Station, HYPO monitored Japanese radio frequencies. The encrypted traffic shifted from confident operational messages to frantic damage reports. The linguists and cryptanalysts heard the panic in the volume and urgency of transmissions. They couldn't decrypt everything in real time, but they didn't need to. The pattern told the story. The Japanese fleet was screaming, and that scream meant their silent war had translated into burning ships visible from space. One cryptanalyst sat motionless, listening to Morse code tap out encrypted chaos, and felt something between triumph and horror. They'd done this. Their work, their endless hours, decoding 5-digit groups, had guided bombs onto targets. Every sailor burning on those carriers was dying because of pencil marks on worksheets in a Hawaiian basement. Victory tasted like guilt. The battle wasn't over. Japan's 4th carrier, Hiryu, escaped the initial devastation and launched a counterstrike. Japanese planes found Yorktown and hit her hard bombs tearing through her decks, torpedoes ripping into her hull. The American carrier listed burning her crew, fighting, flooding, and fire, with the kind of desperate skill that keeps ships afloat when physics says they should sink. But Hiryu's triumph was brief. American dive bombers found her in late afternoon, alone and vulnerable. They hit her the same way they'd hit the others' bombs, plunging through flight decks, detonating among armed and fueled aircraft. Within minutes, Hiryu joined her sister ships in flames. By nightfall on June 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers were burning or sinking. The elite pilots who'd terrorized the Pacific for 6 months were dead or swimming in oil-slicked water. The cream of Japan's naval aviation, irreplaceable veterans with thousands of flight hours, had been wiped out in a single day. Admiral Yamamoto received the reports aboard his flagship Yamato 300 miles to the west. He'd positioned himself to lead the decisive surface engagement that was supposed to follow the carrier battle. His battleships would finish off whatever remained of the American fleet after Nagumo's carriers did their work. Instead, Nagumo's carriers were gone. The Americans remained operational. And Yamamoto's grand strategy, the culmination of months of planning the operation, meant to end the Pacific War in Japan's favor, had collapsed in flames. He stood silent on Yamato's bridge, processing the impossible. His entire operational framework had assumed American ignorance. He'd believed the fleet would be surprised, scattered, unprepared. Instead, they'd been waiting exactly where intelligence said they wouldn't be. They'd known. Somehow, impossibly, they'd known everything. The code. It had to be the code. Yamamoto had harbored doubts about JN-25's security, had worried about overuse, about patterns emerging from volume. His concerns had been dismissed by staff officers confident in their cipher's mathematical complexity. Now those assurances tasted like ash. One of his staff officers later recalled Yamamoto's words spoken quietly in the darkness. The backbone of the Imperial Navy has been broken. It was true in ways that went beyond the immediate tactical defeat. Japan had entered the war with 10 fleet carriers. They'd already lost one at Coral Sea. Now 4 more were gone. Building new carriers would take years. Training new pilots to replace the dead veterans would take even longer. The strategic reserve of experienced naval aviators, accumulated through decades of rigorous selection and training, had been expended in one afternoon. Japan's proud naval traditions stretched back centuries. Samurai turned sailor discipline and precision elevated to art form. A culture that worshipped excellence had produced the finest carrier force the world had ever seen. And in 6 hours that force had been destroyed not by superior courage or better weapons, but by information. They'd built the mightiest navy on earth and then whispered its every move to the enemy. Every encrypted message sent with perfect confidence had been another nail in their own coffin. The very tool meant to ensure secrecy had betrayed them. And the cruelest irony was that they'd done it to themselves by trusting too completely, by using the code too freely, by never imagining that patient men in a basement could hear what was never meant to be heard. The human cost defied easy calculation. Thousands of Japanese sailors died in those burning carriers, young men who'd joined the Navy, believing in their nation's destiny, who'd trained for years to achieve perfection in their craft, who'd written final letters home before the battle that their families would now actually receive. They'd been brave and skilled and disciplined, and none of it mattered because the enemy knew where they'd be and when. On the American side, the pilots who'd flown into that maelstrom, knowing the odds, who'd watched their squadron mates die in flames, who'd somehow survived to land back on their carriers, they carried their own weight. Victory didn't erase the memory of friends spiraling into the ocean trailing smoke. War makes ghosts of everyone it touches. Some die, some live. All are haunted. And in a basement at Pearl Harbor, cryptanalysts listened to the aftermath in encrypted Japanese transmissions and understood that their silent war had spoken with the loudest possible voice. The battle ended. The carriers sank or were scuttled. The ocean swallowed the wreckage and the dead. Yorktown finally succumbed to her wounds days later, torpedoed by a Japanese submarine while under tow. But the strategic outcome was beyond dispute. Japan had gambled everything on Midway and lost. The initiative in the Pacific had shifted, though few recognized it yet. In the windowless basement at Pearl Harbor, life continued much as it had before. The typewriters still clattered. The intercepts still piled up on desks. The work never stopped because the war never stopped. Japanese naval communications continued to flow through the ether, still encrypted in JN-25, still partially readable to the patient analysts who'd learned to hear patterns in noise. But something had changed. The men and women of Station HYPO now knew with absolute certainty that their work mattered. They'd seen the direct line connecting their decoded fragments to burning ships, their intelligence estimates to tactical victory. The abstraction had become concrete. Lives saved and lives ended, all flowing from 5-digit code groups on worksheets. Commander Rochefort should have been celebrated, awarded, promoted. His team's contribution to the victory at Midway was incalculable. They'd given Admiral Nimitz the one thing commanders prize above all else: certainty. In a chaotic fog-shrouded war, they'd provided clear vision. Instead, politics intervened. Washington had never fully trusted Rochefort's methods or his conclusions. The code-breaking establishment back east resented the independent operation he ran in Hawaii. When credit for Midway's intelligence was distributed, bureaucrats and rival analysts claimed portions of recognition. Rochefort's role was minimized, questioned, eventually buried under layers of official reluctance to acknowledge that a disheveled commander in a smoking jacket had been right when the experts were wrong. He was reassigned, pulled from the basement where he'd orchestrated perhaps the greatest intelligence coup of the Pacific War, and sent to command a floating dry dock. The Navy's way of saying, "We're done with you." Station HYPO continued under new leadership. The war ground on. But the men and women who'd been there during those crucial months carried something that couldn't be reassigned or bureaucratically erased. They knew what they'd accomplished. They'd heard the future in enemy transmissions and changed it. Most never spoke about their work, not during the war, not for decades after. Security oaths bound them. Cultural humility silenced them. Some simply couldn't articulate what they'd experienced. How do you explain to someone who wasn't there what it felt like to decrypt an order and know that ships would sink because of what you'd read? How do you describe the weight of invisible responsibility? One operator later said, "Once you've listened to the enemy's heart, you can never unhear it. You know things you shouldn't know. You carry secrets you can't share. And you go home to a world that has no idea what you did or why it mattered." Some never fully returned to ordinary life. They'd spent too long in that liminal space between silence and knowledge, too many hours translating death into 5-digit groups. The war ended, but the listening continued in their heads. Phantom Morse code, tapping in quiet rooms, imagined encrypted messages scrolling behind their eyes when they tried to sleep. Rochefort died in 1976, largely forgotten outside intelligence circles. Only years later, long after his death, did the Navy formally recognize his contribution to Midway. A posthumous Distinguished Service Medal. Official acknowledgement that yes, this eccentric commander in his basement had changed the course of the Pacific War. By then, most of his team was gone too. Scattered back into civilian life, their wartime service classified their names absent from histories, focused on admirals and battles. The people who'd fought with pencils instead of guns, who'd waged war in silence, who'd broken the backbone of Japan's navy without ever seeing the ocean, they faded into obscurity. But their legacy persisted in ways both visible and hidden. The intelligence networks they helped pioneer, the methods they developed for signals analysis, the proof that information could be as decisive as firepower. Bletchley Park and Station HYPO Enigma and JN 25. The hidden war fought by mathematicians and linguists while armies clashed, all part of a larger transformation in how wars were understood and fought. The invisible warriors who heard what couldn't be heard had changed warfare itself. After Midway, Japan never regained naval dominance in the Pacific. They couldn't. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. 4 fleet carriers lost in a single day. Experienced pilots dead or captured. The strategic initiative surrendered to an enemy that now knew it could win. Japan would fight on for 3 more years with the ferocity of a cornered animal. Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each battle more desperate than the last. But the trajectory was set in June 1942, decided not by the bombs that fell on carrier decks, but by the intelligence that guided those bombs to their targets. The battle marked a turning point that went beyond ships and planes. It demonstrated that warfare had evolved into something new, something that previous generations of warriors wouldn't fully recognize. Steel could be rebuilt. Factories could churn out replacement carriers, aircraft weapons. America's industrial capacity would eventually overwhelm Japan's through sheer productive force. But the code once broken could never be hidden again. That was the deeper wound. Japan knew after Midway that their communications were compromised. They changed codes, added complexity, increased security. None of it mattered. The Americans had learned how to listen. The techniques developed at Station HYPO, refined through months of desperate analysis, could adapt to new codes. The advantage had shifted permanently. Information became the permanent asymmetry. America could read Japanese intentions while keeping its own plans secure. Every major operation for the rest of the war benefited from signals intelligence. Fleet movements anticipated, supply convoys intercepted, strategic deployments predicted before they occurred. Admiral Yamamoto himself fell victim to the intelligence war he'd feared. In April 1943, American codebreakers decrypted his travel itinerary. Fighters intercepted his transport plane over Bougainville and shot it down. The architect of Pearl Harbor killed because his schedule was transmitted in a code the enemy could read. There's an ethical dimension to this that history sometimes glosses over in celebrating intelligence victories. Knowledge is power, but power creates responsibility. The codebreakers at Station HYPO didn't just predict where enemies would be. They enabled killing on an industrial scale. Every decrypted message, every intelligence estimate, every successful prediction translated into human beings dying in ways they couldn't have anticipated. The men and women who did this work weren't naive about the consequences. They understood the moral weight. Some carried it with quiet pride. They'd helped win a war against genuine evil, had contributed to defeating fascism. Others struggled with the burden. All those young Japanese sailors who'd burned in carriers, who'd been in the wrong place, because someone in Hawaii had read a message they shouldn't have been able to read. War doesn't offer clean moral categories. It demands choices between terrible options and asks people to live with the consequences. The Pacific War was won not only by men with rifles and pilots in cockpits, but by men and women with pencils and patience, who believed that knowledge could save lives even as it ended others. They fought from basements and believed that listening could matter as much as shooting. Their victory was mathematical in the purest sense, probabilities calculated, patterns analyzed, information transformed into action, cold equations that determined who lived and who died, which nation would prevail and which would surrender. The ocean that had witnessed the battle returned to calm. The wreckage of carriers settled into deep water, where it remains today silent monuments to a battle decided before the first plane launched. Morse code signals that once carried encrypted death faded into static and memory. But the lesson persisted. Sometimes the greatest victories are won before the first shot is fired in windowless rooms by people whose names will never be famous. In June 1942, the Pacific Ocean echoed with explosions. Bombs falling, ships burning, men screaming, the sky filled with smoke and tracer fire, the water churned with debris and fuel and bodies. History remembers the noise, the thunder of battle, the roar of engines, the chaos of ships dying under open sky. But history's loudest victory began in silence. A single code once thought unbreakable fell to patience and intellect. 30,000 five-digit groups meant to hide intentions, instead revealed them to people who refused to accept that anything was truly unknowable. And in that fall, in the slow erosion of mathematical certainty by human persistence, the course of a world war changed. The basement at Pearl Harbor eventually emptied, the war ended, the typewriters went quiet, the intercepted messages stopped flowing. The people who'd worked there scattered back into lives where nobody knew what they'd done, or understood why exhaustion still shadowed their eyes years later. Commander Rochefort died without fame. His team returned to obscurity. The official histories credited admirals and pilots, strategy and courage. The invisible work remained invisible, classified for decades, acknowledged reluctantly only after most of the participants were gone. Yet their work whispered through history like a frequency only certain people could hear. A reminder that wars are fought on multiple planes simultaneously, the visible clash of steel and fire, and the hidden contest of knowledge and deception. That sometimes the quietest rooms echo the loudest victories. That sometimes the most decisive weapons are worn pencils and coffee-stained worksheets, and human minds refusing to surrender to complexity. The mathematics of victory were already written in May 1942, inscribed in 5-digit groups no one was meant to read. The battle at Midway simply revealed what patient listeners already knew. Japan's carriers were doomed the moment their encrypted orders traveled through the air toward receivers manned by people who'd learned to translate silence into strategy. Sometimes the greatest battles are won before the first shot is fired. The ocean keeps its secrets. The carriers rest in darkness beyond where light penetrates. The men who died aboard them are long gone, their sacrifice remembered even as the details fade. And somewhere in archives and fading memories, the story persists of how a war was won, not with guns, but with the quiet determination to hear what was never meant to be heard. In the end, that might be the truest victory, proving that human intellect properly applied can overcome any obstacle, crack any code, see through any deception. Even silence speaks if you know how to listen.